friends, whether you're working for a large Fortune 500 corporation or a small business, you probably want to protect your applications from downtime. Siddharth is here to show me how Azure Site Recovery can help you recover your applications in the event of natural or man-made disasters by leveraging availability zones within an Azure region today on Azure Friday. Hey friends, I'm Scott Hanselman and it's Azure Friday. We're talking with Siddharth here, who's going to talk to me about Azure Site Recovery. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Scott?
I'm living the dream and learning about Azure. I'm excited to keep my sites up. I'm always concerned with disasters can happen. It could be a natural disaster, like something bad, or I could just trip over a wire and mess something up. Literally, I had a disaster today where the power went out in my city in the middle of a workshop that I was giving, but fortunately I had a UPS and my computer and my internet kept running. And the client was so impressed that I had disaster recovery, even though it was just a little battery under my desk.
That is very cool. Yeah, business continuity and disaster recovery is super important, right? And especially when it comes to mission critical applications, you want to make sure that you have a sound business continuity and disaster recovery strategy. And Azure Site Recovery really helps you strengthen that BCDR strategy by helping you recover your applications in the event of a planned or unplanned outage. So if you're doing a disaster recovery drill of sorts, then Azure Site Recovery can help you fail over your VMs and then fail them back once your drill is complete. But God forbid there's an outage, and that could be a natural disaster or a man-made outage, right? There might be a rogue admin who might, like you said, trip a wire somewhere. For those kinds of situations as well, Azure Site Recovery can help you fail over your applications from one site to another and then fail back to your original site once the outage has passed.
Now, I'm used to thinking about websites where you do a ping or you have a health check where you make an HTTP call and then you have to make a decision about what unhealthy is. But with virtual machines and with more sophisticated sites that aren't just my blog, how do you decide that it's a disaster as opposed to a hiccup?
Yeah, great question. So what most customers tend to notice is their applications malfunctioning, right? So if they are unable to use their applications and they notice errors, then that's a clear signal that something's wrong, right? Now, if these virtual machines that are hosting the application happen to be in Azure, then Azure Communications actually sends out an email to you as a user, which clearly communicates that Azure is facing an outage and then encourages you to look at your disaster recovery plan. And then if you as a user believe that it is in your best interests to actually perform a disaster recovery, then Azure Site Recovery helps you to go ahead and do that.
Interesting. And this isn't necessarily a cloud-only situation, right? I might have a physical machine in my office and then I have a backup in the cloud and I could fail up to the cloud?
Yeah, so let me actually share my screen at this point. Yeah, okay. So Azure Site Recovery is a complete disaster recovery solution, right? And it applies whether you are in a on-prem environment or in Azure, right? So if you're on-prem, you could have physical servers on-prem and you could replicate those into Azure. You may be a VMware or a Hyper-V shop, and if you have those VMs, you can replicate those into Azure as well. And recently, we've started supporting Azure Stack. So if you have Azure Stack VMs, those can be replicated as well. And the cool thing is you can fail these over into Azure. And then once the outage passes, or once you're comfortable with your DR drill and you want to fail back, you can fail back to your VMware or Hyper-V environment. Now, a couple of years ago, we launched region to region DR. And what that means is if you're running your VMs on Azure already, say you're located in North Europe and you're running your VMs from the North Europe region, you can actually replicate to West Europe or UK South or any one of the regions in Europe. And you can fail over to that region and then fail back to North Europe anytime you want. So that's a really cool offering, and it's quickly become one of our most highly adopted scenarios, right? So we do this for on-prem machines, whether they be physical servers or virtual machines. We do these for Azure virtual machines as well. And we support all operating systems. So this is not just a Windows offering. We have first-class Linux support, regardless of the distribution you're using, right? Whether that be Ubuntu or Debian or Red Hat, what have you. We support them all. But what I really want to talk about today is our newest offering. We did a preview of this at Ignite last year, and then we went GA a few months ago, and that's zone-to-zone DR.
So availability zones, I remember that if I have a virtual machine and I say, hey, Azure, make 2 virtual machines, they could randomly show up next to each other. They could be in the same rack. They could be near each other in the same aisle inside of this giant warehouse. But by giving them different availability zones, I'm telling Azure, keep these away from each other. Put them on other sides of the building. Is that a way to think about availability zones?
Yes, exactly. So within any region, we have 3 availability zones, and these are 3 separate data centers, right? Which may be a few miles or a couple of dozen miles apart, and you can host your VMs in each availability zone. So if you have 2 VMs, you put the first VM in zone 1, the second VM in zone 3, for example. Then that way you ensure that they are not in the same data center and certainly not in the same rack.
Oh, fantastic. So that's really nice, where I can be in North Europe and I'm not falling over from north to west or to a totally different country. I'm just failing a couple of miles away.
Exactly.
Very cool. Is this hard to set up? Is this something that I would need to spend a lot of time preparing?
No, it's actually super easy to set up. Let me actually show you how. So if I go to my browser here, so I have a virtual machine that I have set up in Southeast Asia, and it's pinned to zone 1, as you can see here, right? Now, if I want to replicate this virtual machine to a different zone within Southeast Asia, then all I need to do is under operations on the left-hand side blade here, I go to disaster recovery. Once I go to this blade, it asks me whether I want to fail over to a different region. And so I have different options here, or I can choose to fail over within the same region, right, using zone to zone. So I say yes to disaster recovery between availability zones. Now, what that does is it pins me to Southeast Asia. And then I can go to advanced settings, and I can actually choose the zone that I want to fail over to. So if you see availability as a field here, then my source is in availability zone 1, which I showed you in the overview blade. But my target can be in availability zone 3 or availability zone 2. And I can choose those. I can also choose other fields. So for example, I can fail over to a different subscription. I can fail over to a different resource group. I may choose to use the same virtual network or a different virtual network. So I can perform a number of different configuration changes here, but I can just choose to accept the defaults, pick a different availability zone, and then review and start replication. Once I do that, it takes a few minutes for a replication to be enabled and for your VM to be protected.
Now, every virtual machine is different. Every application is different. How do I know that my users, or whether they be actual users or whether they be clients that are calling services on those, that they are addressing this? Do they address it by IP address, by DNS name? How do I know when I failed over from one to the other, it is still, addressable?
Great question. So once you actually protect your virtual machine, while protecting it, you can choose the network you want to fail over to. The nice thing about zone-to-zone replication or zone-to-zone disaster recovery is that you can reuse some of the networking components. So you can reuse the same IP address for your secondary virtual machine, all right? And so you do not need to reconfigure your private IP addresses. You can just pick and use the same ones that you were using earlier. And this is a big benefit of zone-to-zone disaster recovery versus region-to-region disaster recovery, where you really have to set up all the networking. In a lot of cases, our customers have complicated networking setups, and many a times they don't want to replicate the same complicated networking across different regions. And for those types of customers, zone-to-zone disaster recovery is actually a great choice, because you literally don't have to change anything with the networking. It just works.
That's fantastic. The last question I have is, where are we thinking about storage? Some virtual machines store on their local VHD, some talk to Cosmos DB, some talk to SQL Server. If you fail over and then fail back, how do you make sure you have data integrity?
Great question. So we actually create a replica disk in the target availability zone, right? So we actually create a disk which is of the same, or if you want to choose a different type of disk, you can choose a different type of disk. But we try to maintain the same disk configuration, and we replicate to a different disk in the target zone. And so once you fail over, we actually spin up a virtual machine for you in the target availability zone and attach that disk that you were replicating to.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's brilliant.
So if I can just go ahead and show you what it looks like to have a protected VM. So if I go ahead and click on redo and start replication here I can see a quick summary of my vault, of my automation account, and I can choose to change any of these. Now, for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to choose and accept the defaults, and I'm going to start replication. Once I start replication, in a few minutes, my VM gets protected, and here I have a second VM that I have already protected, and let me show you what a protected VM looks like. So when I go to the disaster recovery blade, I can see that the VM happens to be protected. The replication health is healthy, which means that we are actually replicating in real time. So any churn, any IOs that are happening on your source virtual machine in your primary availability zone are faithfully replicated into your target availability zone in real time. You also see the recovery point objective here, which is really cool, right? So you have a recovery point objective here of a few seconds. And that's really powerful for customers who can't stand any data loss, right? Recovery point objective is really a measure of the data loss that you might see in the event of an outage. And in this case, you can see that you'll probably lose about 34 seconds worth of data in the event of an outage as soon as you click failover.
Okay.
Now, in the event of a disaster, failing over is really easy. So I can just click on failover here, and then I can choose a recovery point to fail over to. So that recovery point could go back as far as 24 hours by default, but we can go back as far as 72 hours and choose any recovery point. So we can fail over to a point as far as 72 hours back in history. Wow. Now, for most customers, they actually prefer failing over to the latest point, right? And that's what we choose as default. And so if I go ahead and accept the defaults here, so the latest process recovery point was just a few moments ago, right? So I can choose that and click OK, and my failover has begun. Now, failover takes anywhere between 20 to 30 minutes. Our RTO SLA is about 2 hours, but really for most customers, for well over 95% of VMs, we see that the RTO is a few minutes. Now, let me show you a failed over VM, right? So this is a separate VM which I triggered a failover for some time ago. And let me show you what that looks like. So here I have a VM3, which is actually failed over. Right, and I actually failed over and re-protected this back to primary. So you can see that I have re-protected it back to my original zone. The status is protected, the replication health is healthy, and again, I am ready to go and fail back to my on-premise. And just to show you where I am now with this virtual machine, you can see that I'm actually in zone 3. So I have failed over this virtual machine from zone 1 to zone 3, and all of this takes just a few minutes.
Could you again tell us the acronyms RPO and RTL?
Sure. So RPO refers to recovery point objective. And the way to think about it is a measure of the data loss that you might see in the event of an outage. Right. So typically the RPO that you might see is of a few minutes. So if you see an RPO of say 5 minutes, for example, that means that you are going to lose data worth about 5 minutes in the event of an outage. Now, RTO, which is recovery time objective, is actually a measure of the time it takes to spin up your application again in the secondary data center. So if the RTO is 5 minutes, that means that it's going to take 5 minutes after you click on failover for your application to become accessible in the target region or the target zone, as the case may be.
I see. So there's the returning back to live, returning to live and being ready to service users. And then there's that moment of data loss. So even though you said it might take 10 minutes or 20 minutes, there's a lot of work happening underneath in the background to make sure that you're shuttling data, replications, and disks back and forth.
Exactly. We actually spin up a VM. So your VM in the target zone is actually not up until you click on failover, right? And that's a really cool functionality because it drastically reduces the total cost of operations of your disaster recovery setup. You don't need to keep your compute resources up and running at all times. Only when you actually fail over do we actually bring up the compute resources in the target zone or the target region, as the case may be.
Wow. This feels like something that everyone should have. Now, is this part of just running virtual machines? Does everyone have this? Does it cost to do recovery, or is it just part of the cost of a virtual machine?
No, there is an additional cost on this, Scott. So it's $25 per VM per month. And customers tend to use it for their business critical applications. So really, before they get to Azure Site Recovery as the tool of choice, they actually perform an audit of their environment and try to figure out which of their applications are mission critical versus which are not. And for their mission critical applications, which cannot tolerate any outage whatsoever, they choose Azure Site Recovery as the default disaster recovery solution.
That's great. And you said that availability zone is a new feature that is just recently out. So that's new, separate from region to region failover.
That's right. So we launched region to region failover in 2018, and it is one of our most popular scenarios. So customers can choose to actually failover between regions using the region to region DR scenario. But zone to zone disaster recovery is something that we launched in June earlier this year. And that's available in Southeast Asia and UK South. The reason we actually launched it is quite interesting, Scott. So in most of our geographies, we have region pairs, right? So if you look at any large Azure region, so for example, if you look at UK, you have two regions in UK, right? UK South and UK West. Or if you look at France, we have a couple of regions there. We have many regions in the US, right? So most of our geos are covered from a region pair perspective. But when it comes to Southeast Asia, which happens to be Singapore, Singapore is actually a city-state which is not very large, right? And so it's difficult to house two regions which are a few hundred miles away from each other inside of Southeast Asia. And for those type of customers who have just one region in their geo, and who are concerned about data residency, they often don't want to or are not comfortable failing over into a different region. So for example, for Southeast Asia, which is Singapore, you may choose to fail over to Hong Kong, but a lot of our financial services customers in Singapore are not comfortable failing over to Hong Kong because they have strict data residency requirements and legal compliance issues, and therefore they cannot move their data and their applications outside of Singapore. And so for those type of customers, zone-to-zone disaster recovery is ideal because that way you're actually ensuring that your data and your application never leaves the regional boundary, right? It's constrained to a particular region, but you're also failing over between zones. And so you're covered from a disaster recovery standpoint as well.
Very cool. So where can folks go to learn more about zone-to-zone disaster recovery and see if it applies to what their technology needs are?
Sure. So we actually have extensive documentation. So if you go to Azure Docs, you can read up on how to enable Azure VM disaster recovery between availability zones. I just showed you the portal experience, but we also support PowerShell, and we have a rich set of REST APIs, so customers can choose to use those as well if they so choose. And all of that is documented in Azure Docs.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Thanks, Scott. It was great to be on your show.
I am learning all about how to protect my applications across zones within the same region using Azure Site Recovery today on Azure Friday. Hey, thanks for watching this episode of Azure Friday. Now I need you to like it, comment on it, tell your friends, retweet it. Watch more Azure Friday.